Get out of here before I throw you in a holding cell. The veteran police officer barked, his hand resting aggressively on his heavy leather utility belt. He sneered down at the unassuming black woman standing in the courthouse hallway, utterly convinced she was just another clueless defendant who had wandered into the restricted staff corridor. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stared directly at his silver badge, silently memorizing the engraved numbers. Less than an hour later, that same arrogant officer stood in the main courtroom, waiting to testify in his biggest case of the year. The bailiff shouted, "All rise," and the heavy oak doors swung open. What happened next destroyed that officer's career forever. Morning sunlight sliced through the tall, arched windows of the Monroe County Courthouse, casting long geometric shadows across the polished marble floors. It was a Tuesday, a day notorious in the criminal justice system for heavy dockets and exhausted tempers. Officer Bradley Miller stood guard near the rear staff entrance, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He had been on the city police force for 18 years, a tenure that had calcified his worst instincts. Instead of wisdom, his years on the beat had given him a bloated sense of superiority and a deeply ingrained habit of snapping judgments based on nothing but his own prejudice. Bradley was not supposed to be working courthouse security today. He was a patrol veteran, but a recent string of excessive force complaints, including a highly publicized incident where he had aggressively manhandled a local bakery owner over a minor parking infraction, had forced his commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, to pull him off the streets. Reassigned to door duty, while internal affairs conducted their sluggish review, Bradley was seething. He viewed the assignment as beneath him, a humiliating babysitting job for men in suits. Footsteps echoed down the long corridor leading from the rear parking garage. Bradley straightened up slightly, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the approaching figure. It was a woman in her early 40s carrying a large, heavy cardboard box filled with thick legal volumes, a few desk ornaments, and a framed photograph. She wore a simple beige trench coat over a modest navy blue dress, her hair pulled back into a neat professional bun. This was Rosalind Hayes. What Bradley did not know, and what his prejudiced mind could not fathom, was that Rosalind was not only a brilliant legal mind with 2 decades of flawless litigation experience, but she had also just been appointed as the newest Superior Court judge for the district. Today was her very first day on the bench. Because she had not yet moved into her permanent chambers, Rosalind was using the rear entrance to bring in her personal effects before the official swearing-in ceremony and her morning docket. She adjusted the heavy box in her arms, letting out a quiet sigh as she approached the double-glass doors marked "Restricted Access, Judiciary, and Authorized Personnel Only." Bradley stepped directly into her path, blocking the doors with his imposing frame. "Read the sign." Bradley snapped, not bothering to offer a greeting. His tone was laced with immediate condescension. Rosalind stopped balancing the box on her hip. She looked at the officer, slightly taken aback by the hostility radiating from him. "Good morning, officer. I'm heading up to the 3rd floor chambers. I just need to get through here. I don't care where you think you're heading," Bradley replied, his voice rising in volume. He looked her up and down, his eyes filled with unfiltered disdain. "The sign says restricted access. That means court staff and judges only. The public entrance is around the front of the building past the metal detectors. You need to turn around and walk away. Now." Rosalind maintained her composure. She was no stranger to being underestimated or profiled. Throughout her entire career from law school to the prosecutor's office, she had fought against men who looked exactly like Bradley Miller, men who assumed she was a secretary, a court reporter, or a defendant's grieving relative. She took a slow, calming breath. "Officer, I understand you are doing your job," Rosalind said, keeping her voice even and polite. "My ID badge is at the bottom of my purse, which is underneath this box. If you could just open the door, I can set this down on the security desk inside and show you my credentials. Bradley let out a harsh, mocking laugh. Yeah, nice try. Do you think I was born yesterday? Listen, lady, I don't care if your boyfriend is on trial today or if you're trying to sneak in some contraband to your brother in lockup. You're not getting through this door, so take your little box of junk and get out of this hallway before I decide to cite you for trespassing. The blatant disrespect in his words hung heavy in the cold air of the corridor. Rosalind's eyes hardened. The polite smile vanished from her face, replaced by the stoic, impenetrable expression that had terrified opposing counsel for years. Excuse me, Rosalind asked softly, the quiet volume of her voice carrying a sharp edge. What exactly did you just accuse me of? You heard me. Bradley aggressively stepped forward, closing the distance between them. He was intentionally trying to use his height and his uniform to intimidate her. I know how this works. You people always think you can talk your way past security. I said get out. I'm not going to tell you again. Officer, Rosalind said, her voice dropping an octave, radiating absolute authority. You are making a profound mistake. I strongly advise you to step aside. Bradley's face turned a violent shade of crimson. In his 18 years on the force, he was accustomed to people cowering when he raised his voice. He demanded absolute compliance, and this woman's refusal to back down infuriated him. He reached out his heavy hand, grabbing her forcefully by the shoulder of her trench coat. Shoving his weight forward, Bradley practically pushed Rosalind backward. The sudden physical assault caused the heavy cardboard box to slip from her grasp. It crashed onto the marble floor, splitting open. Heavy, leather-bound books spilled out, sliding across the polished stone. The framed photograph of Rosalind's late father, the man who had worked 2 jobs to send her to law school, shattered, the glass fracturing into dozens of sharp, jagged pieces. Rosalind stumbled back a step, catching her balance before she could fall. A terrifying silence fell over the hallway. I told you to get out, Bradley yelled, his hand dropping down to rest on his handcuffs. Next time you're going out of here in silver bracelets, pick up your garbage and use the front door like the rest of the public. Rosalind stood perfectly still. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a mix of adrenaline and profound righteous anger flooding her veins. She looked down at the shattered glass over her father's smiling face. She slowly raised her head and locked eyes with Bradley. She didn't shout back. She didn't curse. She simply studied the silver shield pinned to his chest. Officer Bradley Miller. She read aloud, committing the name and the badge number 4482 to her eidetic memory. Remove your hand from your belt. Are you giving me orders now? Bradley scoffed, though an imperceptible tremor of unease crawled up his spine at how terrifyingly calm she was. Most people would be screaming or crying by now. She was looking at him as if he were a bug under a microscope. I am giving you an opportunity to de-escalate before you ruin your own life, Rosalind stated flatly. She bent down, ignoring the officer completely, and began gathering her scattered belongings. She carefully picked up the broken frame holding it so the glass wouldn't cut her hands, and placed the heavy books back into the damaged box. Bradley stood over her, breathing heavily, feeling a twisted sense of victory. He watched as she lifted the broken box, turned on her heel, and walked away toward the public entrance, without another word. Yeah, that's what I thought, Bradley muttered to himself, adjusting his belt. He felt incredibly smug, entirely unaware that he had just sealed his own fate. 30 minutes later, the dynamic of the courthouse shifted. Bradley was relieved from his door duty by another officer and made his way up to the 3rd floor. He walked into courtroom 302, a grand wood-panelled room that commanded respect. He swaggered down the central aisle, passing the gallery benches, and stepped past the wooden bar. He was the star witness in a high-profile narcotics trafficking case today. The district attorney's office needed his testimony to secure a conviction, and Bradley was eager to take the stand. A major conviction like this would force Captain Reynolds to put him back on active street duty and clear his name with internal affairs. He leaned against the prosecutor's table, smirking as he chatted with Assistant District Attorney Jonathan Croft. "You ready for this, Miller?" Croft asked, shuffling through a stack of manila folders. "Born ready, counselor." Bradley grinned, puffing out his chest. "Should be an open and shut case. Actually had to deal with some crazy woman downstairs trying to sneak into the staff halls this morning. Had to toss her out on her ear. The trash they let wander around this building is unbelievable." Croft frowned, slightly distracted by his notes. "Just keep your focus on the stand. We have a new judge today taking over for Judge Harrison, who retired last month. I hear she's a total hardliner. Absolutely no nonsense. We don't know how she runs her courtroom yet, so be professional." "I'm always professional," Bradley lied smoothly, taking his seat behind the prosecution table. Across the room, the defense attorney, a sharp-suited man named Richard Blaine, sat next to his client, organizing his own files. The gallery behind them was packed with reporters, law students, and curious onlookers. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Meanwhile, behind the heavy oak doors at the front of the room, Rosalind Hayes was standing in the judge's private chambers. The chief judge, an elderly man named Harrison Sterling, had met her at the front entrance after security had hurriedly ushered her through. When he saw the broken glass and heard what happened, he had been appalled, but Rosalind had politely asked him to let her handle the situation in her own courtroom. She stood before a full-length mirror. She unbelted her trench coat and laid it across a leather armchair. With practiced, deliberate movements, she lifted the heavy black judicial robe off its wooden hanger. As she slipped her arms into the wide sleeves and zipped it up to her collar, the transformation was complete. She was no longer just Rosalind Hayes, the woman in the hallway. She was the Honourable Judge Hayes, the absolute authority of courtroom 302. She looked at her reflection. Her expression was like carved granite. She picked up a small file from her desk, the prosecution's witness list for the morning's first case. Right at the top, printed in bold letters, was Officer Bradley Miller, badge number 4482. A cold, determined light flickered in her eyes. Out in the courtroom, the side door opened, and Bailiff Arthur Penhaligon, a tall man with a booming voice, stepped up to his podium. He struck the wooden block with his gavel. The sharp crack echoed through the massive room, instantly silencing the murmurs of the crowd. Bradley Miller sat up straight, straightening his tie, ready to charm the new judge. "All rise!" Bailiff Penhaligon bellowed. Every single person in the courtroom stood to their feet. The rustling of fabric and scraping of wooden chairs filled the air. "The Superior Court of Monroe County is now in session. The Honourable Judge Rosalind Hayes presiding. God save the state and this honourable court." The heavy oak doors directly behind the high mahogany bench slowly swung open. Bradley Miller pasted a respectful, confident smile on his face, looking up at the bench. Rosalind walked out. The black robes billowed slightly around her ankles as she ascended the 3 steps to the elevated judicial seat. She didn't look down at her notes. She didn't look at the prosecutor. She stepped behind the bench, stood tall, and locked her eyes directly onto Officer Bradley Miller. The confident smile on Bradley's face didn't just fade, it shattered. All the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of pale grey. His jaw went slack, and his eyes bulged in pure, unadulterated horror. His hands resting on the wooden table began to tremble uncontrollably. It was her, the woman from the hallway, the woman whose property he had broken, the woman he had physically assaulted and threatened to throw in a holding cell just 45 minutes ago. Rosalind stood there for 5 agonizing seconds, letting the absolute terror wash over the corrupt officer. She watched his chest heave as panic set in. She watched him realize that his career, his freedom, and his entire life were currently sitting in the palm of her hand. Then she picked up her wooden gavel. Bang! "Be seated," Judge Hayes commanded. The real trial was about to begin. The deafening crack of the wooden gavel echoed through courtroom 302, snapping the tension like a dry branch. The gallery, the jury, and the attorneys collectively sank back into their heavy oak chairs, rustling papers and settling in for the morning docket. But Officer Bradley Miller remained frozen. He hovered a few inches above his seat at the prosecution table. His knees locked his lungs, refusing to draw in air. "Officer Miller." Assistant District Attorney Jonathan Croft whispered harshly, tugging at the sleeve of Bradley's uniform. "Sit down. What is wrong with you?" Bradley collapsed into his chair, as if the strings holding him up had been suddenly cut. His heart was hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against his ribs. He felt a cold drop of sweat trace a path down his spine, soaking into the cotton of his undershirt. He slowly lifted his eyes, praying that his mind had played a cruel trick on him. But it was no trick. There she sat, elevated above them all, draped in the heavy black robes of the judiciary. Judge Rosalind Hayes, the woman whose path he had physically blocked, the woman whose coat he had grabbed, the woman whose late father's photograph he had shattered on the hard marble floor less than an hour ago. Her expression was a masterclass in judicial composure. She did not glare at him. She did not smirk. She simply arranged the files on her bench with meticulous, deliberate movements, her face a mask of absolute, terrifying neutrality. To the rest of the courtroom, she looked like a focused professional jurist, ready to hear her first case. To Bradley, she looked like an executioner, casually sharpening an axe. "We are on the record in the matter of the state versus Leo Patterson." Judge Hayes announced, her voice projecting clearly through the microphone. It was the exact same smooth, commanding tone she had used in the hallway when she warned him he was making a profound mistake. "Are the people ready to proceed?" "The people are ready, Your Honor," Croft said, standing up enthusiastically. "We call our first and primary witness, Officer Bradley Miller, to the stand." Bradley felt his stomach plummet into his heavy black boots. He swallowed hard, his throat as dry as sandpaper. He pushed himself up from the table, his legs feeling like lead. Every step toward the witness box felt like a march to the gallows. He kept his eyes fixed strictly on the floor, terrified to meet the judge's gaze. Bailiff Arthur Penhaligon approached with a worn Bible. "Raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God." "I do," Bradley croaked. His voice, usually a booming instrument of intimidation, sounded thin and reedy. "Please be seated and state your name and badge number for the record," the bailiff instructed. Bradley sat heavily in the wooden chair. He adjusted the microphone. "Officer Bradley Miller. Badge number 4482. He couldn't help it. As he said the numbers, his eyes involuntarily darted up to the bench. Judge Hayes was looking directly at him. She held a sleek silver pen, tapping it lightly against a legal pad. He knew with absolute horrifying certainty that she already knew his badge number by heart. "Officer Miller." Croft began stepping out from behind the prosecution table. "Can you please direct the jury's attention to the night of October 12th? You were on routine patrol in the downtown district, correct?" "That is correct," Bradley answered, wiping his sweaty palms on the fabric of his trousers. "And during that patrol, you initiated a traffic stop on a blue sedan driven by the defendant, Mr. Leo Patterson. Could you explain to the court your probable cause for initiating that stop?" Bradley knew this script. He had recited it dozens of times in his career. It was the standard narrative he used to justify pulling over young men he simply didn't like the look of. "I observed the vehicle swerving slightly within its lane. When I ran the plates, it came back registered to an address in a known high-crime area. As I approached the vehicle, I immediately detected the strong odor of marijuana, giving me probable cause to initiate a search of the interior. Objection. Defense attorney Richard Blaine called out, standing up. Calls for a legal conclusion regarding probable cause. The officer can state his observations, not rule on their legality. Sustained, Judge Hayes said smoothly. The jury will disregard the officer's statement regarding probable cause. Officer, please restrict your testimony strictly to what you physically observed. Bradley bristled. It was a minor correction, a standard judicial ruling, but in his panicked state, he felt like she was already tightening the noose. I smelled marijuana. Bradley amended, his jaw clenching. And upon searching the vehicle, what did you discover? Croft prompted, oblivious to the psychological warfare happening in front of him. I discovered a hidden compartment under the passenger seat containing 3 plastic bags. Bradley said, his confidence returning slightly as he recounted the physical evidence. The bags contained a large quantity of prescription narcotics, specifically oxycodone, not prescribed to the defendant. Did the defendant cooperate with this search? Croft asked. Bradley hesitated. This was the crux of his police report. He had written that Leo Patterson had been belligerent aggressive and had actively resisted, which justified Bradley physically throwing the young man onto the hood of the cruiser and leaving nasty bruises on his wrist from the handcuffs. Bradley looked at Croft, then stole a glance at Judge Hayes. She was leaning forward slightly, her dark eyes piercing straight through his chest. She knew exactly what a belligerent and aggressive civilian looked like in Bradley's twisted, self-serving worldview. She had been one just an hour ago. Bradley stammered, his voice faltering. The suspect became highly agitated. He was shouting, refusing to comply with verbal commands, and exhibiting aggressive body language. I was forced to use necessary physical restraint for my own safety. Judge Hayes didn't blink. She merely picked up her silver pen and made a single slow note on her legal pad. The scratching of the pen nib against the paper sounded as loud as a gunshot in Bradley's ears. Thank you, officer. Croft smiled, turning back to his table. No further questions at this time. Your witness, Mr. Blaine. Richard Blaine, a sharp, impeccably dressed defense attorney known for ruthlessly dismantling police testimony, stood up and buttoned his suit jacket. He walked slowly to the center of the room, letting the silence stretch out, making Bradley squirm in the witness box. Officer Miller. Blaine began, his tone deceptively conversational. You testified that my client, a 22-year-old college student with 0 criminal record, suddenly became violent and aggressive during a routine traffic stop. Is that accurate? He was not complying with my lawful orders, Bradley said, defensively shifting his weight. Your lawful orders, Blaine repeated, tasting the words. Officer, in your 18 years on the force, you've issued a lot of lawful orders, haven't you? I have done my job. Bradley shot back, his temper beginning to simmer beneath his fear. He hated defense attorneys. He hated having his authority questioned. And doing your job often involves escalating situations, doesn't it? Blaine asked, pacing in front of the jury box. In fact, officer, isn't it true that you are currently assigned to courthouse door duty because you are under active investigation by Internal Affairs for using excessive force on a civilian just 3 weeks ago? Objection! Croft shouted, leaping to his feet. Relevance highly prejudicial. That investigation is ongoing and has absolutely nothing to do with this narcotics case. Bradley looked toward the bench, expecting the judge to shield him. Standard courtroom procedure usually protected officers from having unrelated, unresolved IA investigations dragged in front of a jury. Judge Hayes looked down at Croft, then shifted her gaze to Blaine. Mr. Blaine, what is the relevance of this line of questioning? Goes directly to the witness's credibility and character, Your Honor. Blaine argued smoothly. The entire prosecution rests on Officer Miller's subjective claim that my client was the aggressor which justified an illegal search. I intend to show that Officer Miller has a well-documented habit of falsely labeling civilians as aggressive to cover up his own unprovoked hostility. Bradley's breath hitched. Blaine was describing exactly what had happened in the staff hallway. Judge Hayes remained perfectly still. A heavy, charged silence hung over the courtroom. Bradley silently pleaded with her, his eyes wide with desperate panic. "Don't do it," he thought. "Please." "The objection is overruled," Judge Hayes declared, her voice ringing with absolute finality. "The defense may proceed. The witness's credibility regarding his assessment of civilian aggression is central to the disputed facts of this search." Croft sank back into his chair, stunned. Bradley felt the blood drain from his face once again. The shield of his badge had just been stripped away by the very woman he had tried to humiliate. "Thank you, Your Honor," Blaine said, turning back to Bradley with a predatory gleam in his eye. "Let's review, officer. You claim my client was aggressive, yet the dashcam footage from your cruiser conveniently experienced a technical malfunction during the exact 3 minutes you claim he was resisting. How fortunate for you. Equipment fails. It's out of my control." Bradley gritted his teeth, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the armrests of the witness chair. "Does your temper fail too?" Officer Blaine asked, stepping closer. "Because the internal affairs complaint filed by Mr. Thomas, the bakery owner, states that you grabbed him by the collar, shoved him against a brick wall, and threatened to throw him in a holding cell, all because he asked you not to park your cruiser in his loading zone. Does that sound familiar?" "I was securing a scene." Bradley's voice rose, the familiar ugly anger bubbling up, overriding his fear of the judge. He hated being cornered. People think they can talk back to law enforcement, disrespect the uniform. They need to learn compliance. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. The jury watched him wide-eyed, taking in the sudden volatile shift in his demeanor. The calm professional officer had vanished, replaced by a defensive, aggressive bully. "Compliance," Blaine echoed softly. He walked back to his table and picked up a single sheet of paper. "Officer Miller, I want to ask you a very specific question. You are under oath. The penalty for perjury is severe, up to 5 years in state prison. Do you understand that?" Bradley swallowed dryly. "I understand. Have you ever in your capacity as an officer of the law physically assaulted, intimidated, or threatened an innocent civilian simply because you felt they did not show you immediate, unwarranted submission? Have you ever fabricated a threat to justify your own aggression?" The courtroom held its breath. Bradley looked at Blaine. Then his eyes were drawn, as if by a magnetic force, up to Judge Rosalind Hayes. She was looking down at him. The expression on her face was no longer neutral. It was a look of cold, calculating judgment. She knew the truth. She possessed the physical proof of his aggression, the bruises forming on her shoulder, the shattered glass of her father's picture in her chambers. If he said yes, his career was over. The defense would tear his testimony apart. Leo Patterson would walk free, and the DA would likely charge him with perjury and civil rights violations. If he said no, he would be lying under oath, looking directly into the eyes of the judge, who was his most recent victim. He would be betting his entire life that Judge Hayes would maintain professional detachment and not destroy him. Bradley's massive ego, built upon 18 years of unchecked power, made the decision for him. He couldn't admit weakness. Not here. Not in front of everyone. Bradley sat up straight, jutted his chin out, and looked the defense attorney dead in the eye. "No," Bradley stated firmly, his voice echoing in the silent room. "I have never done that. I treat every civilian with the utmost respect, and I only use force when absolutely necessary. Behind the mahogany bench, Judge Rosalind Hayes did not gasp. She did not shake her head. She simply picked up her silver pen, clicked the top, and drew a thick, heavy line across her legal pad. The trap had been set, and the arrogant officer had just walked right into it, locking the door from the inside. "I see," Blaine said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "No further questions, Your Honor." "You may step down, Officer Miller," Judge Hayes commanded. As Bradley stood on trembling legs to leave the witness box, he felt a fleeting surge of relief. He had survived the cross-examination. He had held his ground. But as he turned to walk back down the aisle, he caught a glimpse of Judge Hayes signaling the bailiff. The real trial hadn't even begun, and Bradley Miller had no idea that a ticking time bomb was waiting for him right outside the courtroom doors. Sweat beaded on Bradley Miller's forehead as he practically collapsed into his chair at the prosecution table. He grabbed a flimsy paper cup of water, his large hands shaking so violently that the chilled liquid sloshed over the brim and soaked into the crisp blue cuff of his uniform shirt. He had survived the cross-examination. He had lied under oath, stared down the devil herself, and somehow made it out of the witness box intact. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to slow his hammering heart. Assistant District Attorney Jonathan Croft leaned over his voice, a harsh, furious whisper that barely concealed his panic. "What the hell was that, Miller? You didn't tell me Internal Affairs was actively breathing down your neck for an excessive force complaint. You just handed the defense attorney a massive, heavy club to beat our case to death with. If we lose this conviction, it's on you." Bradley scowled, keeping his voice defensively low. "It's a bogus, trumped-up complaint by some whiny civilian baker who thinks he owns the street. It doesn't mean anything. Just redirect the jury, summarize the drug evidence, and close the case. We have the kid dead to rights." Across the aisle, Richard Blaine stood tall at the defense table, his suit jacket perfectly buttoned. He did not look like a man who was ready to rest his case. He looked like a man holding a royal flush. "Your Honor." Blaine's voice rang out clear and confident. "The defense calls our next witness. We call Mr. Robert G. Hemlock to the stand." Croft frowned frantically, scrambling through his disorganized stack of manila file folders. "Objection, Your Honor. I don't have a Robert Hemlock anywhere on the defense's approved witness list. This is an ambush, pure and simple. The state has not been given ample time to prepare for this testimony." Judge Hayes looked down from the elevated bench with glacial, terrifying calm. "Mr. Blaine, would you care to explain?" "Mr. Hemlock was legally added to our amended witness list, submitted directly to the clerk, just 30 minutes before proceedings began this morning. Your Honor." Blaine replied smoothly, handing a freshly stamped document to Bailiff Penhaligon to pass up to the judge and over to the DA. "His testimony goes directly to the absolute destruction of Officer Miller's credibility and proves beyond a shadow of a doubt a documented pattern of systemic perjury. Overruled." Judge Hayes declared her gavel, striking the sounding block with a sharp crack. "The witness may proceed." A man in a sharp, tailored grey suit walked down the central aisle of the courtroom. He carried a sleek silver briefcase. He was sworn in by the bailiff and took a seat in the witness box that Bradley had just vacated. "Please state your name and occupation for the record," Blaine instructed, leaning against the wooden railing of the jury box. "Robert G. Hemlock," the man stated clearly into the microphone. "I am the Senior Systems Administrator for Vanguard Secure Tech Solutions. We are the private third-party contractors responsible for the installation, maintenance, and data retention of the Monroe County Courthouse's internal security matrix." Bradley felt a cold, paralyzing dread wash over his entire body. His stomach cramped violently, acid burning the back of his throat. Security matrix. Cameras. He mentally scrambled, trying to picture the hallway architecture. He had worked details in this building for years. The rear corridor cameras were notoriously broken ancient relics from the late 90s, that the county council never had the municipal budget to fix. He was sure of it. They were dummy domes. Mr. Hemlock. Blaine continued pacing slowly across the polished floor. Did your company recently complete a system-wide upgrade of the surveillance equipment in this specific building? Yes, sir, we did. We finalized the installation of high-definition audio-enabled recording units over the weekend. The entire county grid went fully operational yesterday morning at exactly 600 hours. Bradley's vision literally blurred. The edges of the courtroom began to swim. Audio-enabled, high-definition, yesterday. And pursuant to a rapid emergency subpoena I filed directly with the clerk earlier this morning, Blaine said, reaching into his pocket and holding up a sleek silver USB drive. Did you pull the raw, unedited digital footage from camera node 4B, which monitors the ground floor restricted staff entrance? I did, Hemlock confirmed. The footage is securely encrypted, timestamped by the server and completely unaltered. Croft stood up, looking deeply confused and highly irritated. Your Honor, I must object again to relevance. What does security footage from the courthouse basement this morning have to do with a felony traffic stop from last month? This is a theatrical distraction. Judge Hayes leaned forward, her dark eyes locking onto Bradley with the terrifying intensity of a predator cornering its wounded prey. Mr. Croft, your star witness, just testified under penalty of perjury that he has never physically assaulted, intimidated, or fabricated a threat against an innocent civilian to justify his own aggression. The defense is offering physical evidence to directly impeach that sworn statement. I will allow it. Mr. Blaine, you may publish the video to the courtroom. Bailiff Penhaligon walked over to the wall panel and dimmed the heavy, ornate overhead chandeliers. A large flat-screen monitor mounted on a rolling steel cart was wheeled to the center of the room by a court clerk. It was angled precisely so the 12 members of the jury, the judge on the bench and the packed gallery could all see it perfectly. Blaine plugged the silver drive into the attached laptop. Let the record reflect, Blaine announced, his voice carrying a lethal, uncompromising edge, that we are viewing footage time-stamped today at exactly 8:14 a.m. Bradley wanted to run. Every primal survival instinct in his brain screamed at him to kick his chair back, bolt through the heavy oak doors, and disappear into the chaotic city streets. But his thick legs wouldn't obey. He was anchored to his seat by sheer terror, forced to sit and watch his own public execution. The large screen flickered to life. It was a crystal-clear, high-definition angle of the rear staff corridor. The morning sunlight cascaded beautifully across the geometric marble floors. And there he was. Officer Bradley Miller standing near the double glass doors with his arms crossed over his chest, looking thoroughly bored, arrogant, and aggressive. A few seconds later, a woman walked into the digital frame. She was carrying a heavy cardboard box filled with books and personal items. The jury leaned forward in their seats. Croft squinted at the screen, adjusting his glasses. A collective gasp, quiet but entirely undeniable, rippled through the packed gallery behind the wooden bar. Even through the slight digital compression of the monitor, every single person in courtroom 302 instantly recognized the beige trench coat, the neat professional bun, and the calm, authoritative posture. It was Judge Rosalind Hayes. Bradley squeezed his eyes tightly shut desperately, wishing the floor would open up and swallow him whole. Crisp digital audio filled the silent courtroom. Read the sign. Bradley's arrogant, condescending voice barked from the speakers, echoing horribly off the wood-panelled walls. The jury watched mesmerized and absolutely horrified as the confrontation unfolded. They heard the woman, their presiding judge, politely and calmly explain that her ID badge was under the heavy box. They heard Bradley's cruel, mocking laugh. They heard him boldly accuse her of smuggling contraband to a prisoner. Take your little box of junk and get out of this hallway before I decide to cite you for trespassing. The digital Bradley threatened aggressively, stepping into her personal space. Jonathan Croft, the prosecutor, dropped his silver pen. It clattered loudly against the wooden table, rolling onto the floor, but he didn't even notice. He stared blankly at the screen, his mouth hanging slightly open, all the color draining from his face. He looked from the monitor to the stoic judge on the bench, then slowly turned his head to stare at Bradley Miller with an expression of absolute, unadulterated disgust. The video continued mercilessly. The tension in the courtroom ratcheted up to a dangerous breaking point. They watched Judge Hayes calmly advise the officer to step aside and de-escalate. Then came the sudden explosion of violence. The footage clearly showed Bradley lunging forward, his heavy hand grabbing the judge's shoulder with brutal, unnecessary force, physically shoving her backward. The heavy cardboard box tumbled to the marble floor. The sharp, unmistakable sound of shattering glass. The destruction of her late father's framed photograph cracked violently through the courtroom's surround sound speakers. "Next time you're going out of here in silver bracelets," Bradley roared on the screen, his hand resting menacingly on his utility belt. The video showed Judge Hayes calmly reading his badge number aloud, gathering her broken belongings from the floor, and walking away with silent, impenetrable dignity. Blaine pressed the spacebar, pausing the video on a high-definition full-screen freeze-frame of Bradley Miller's sneering, furious, out-of-control face. Total suffocating silence descended upon courtroom 302. Nobody breathed. The jury members looked at Bradley with naked revulsion. The reporters in the back row were practically vibrating with adrenaline, their pens flying across their notepads. "Your Honor," Blaine said softly, shattering the quiet. "I believe the defense rests." Jonathan Croft stood up slowly. He didn't look at his carefully prepared notes. He didn't look at the defense attorney. He looked directly up at the bench. His political career was on the line, and he knew a sinking ship when he saw one. Every case Bradley had ever touched was about to be overturned. Croft was absolutely not going down with a corrupt, lying cop. "Your Honor!" Croft announced, his voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage and humiliation. "In light of newly presented irrefutable evidence regarding the credibility and violent character of the state's primary witness, the District Attorney's Office is immediately dropping all charges against Mr. Leo Patterson. We formally move for a full dismissal with prejudice." A massive, echoing sigh of relief washed over the defense table. Young Leo Patterson buried his face in his trembling hands, crying silent tears of salvation. "Motion granted." Judge Hayes struck her heavy wooden gavel. "The charges are dismissed. Mr. Patterson, you are free to go." Then, Judge Hayes stood up. The heavy black robes settled around her shoulders as she looked down from the elevated mahogany bench. The stoic professional neutrality was completely gone. In its place was the formidable, uncompromising wrath of the justice system incarnate. "Officer Miller." Her voice boomed, carrying the terrifying weight of a thunderclap. "Stand up." Bradley couldn't feel his legs. He gripped the edge of the prosecution table, hauling his massive frame upright. He looked like a deflated balloon, a pathetic, trembling shell of the arrogant bully who had swaggered into the room an hour ago. Just moments ago, you sat in that witness chair, swore a sacred oath to God, and stated unequivocally that you have never assaulted or fabricated threats against a civilian. Judge Hayes declared her words, slicing through the air like a surgical scalpel. "We have just witnessed you commit brazen, undeniable felony perjury in my courtroom." Bradley opened his mouth, gasping for air, but no sound came out. "Furthermore," she continued, her voice rising in commanding authority, "as a sworn officer of the law, you abused your power, resorted to unprovoked physical violence, and unlawfully assaulted a citizen. You are a profound disgrace to the uniform you wear and a toxic, volatile danger to the public you took an oath to protect." She paused, letting her damning words sink into every corner of the silent room. Pursuant to my absolute authority as a superior court judge, I am holding you in direct criminal contempt of court. She announced, her eyes locked onto his pale face. I am also issuing an immediate bench warrant for your arrest on felony charges of first-degree perjury, official misconduct, and assault. Bradley's eyes widened in sheer terror. Your Honor, please. I didn't know who you were. Ignorance is not a legal defense, Mr. Miller. Judge Hayes snapped, shutting him down instantly with brutal efficiency. And more importantly, it is entirely irrelevant. Your true character is defined by how you treat vulnerable people when you think no one with power is watching. You failed the test. She looked past the shattered, ruined officer. Bailiff Penhaligon. The tall, imposing bailiff stepped forward from the side wall, his face a mask of grim, righteous satisfaction. Yes, Your Honor. Take this man into custody, she ordered. The sharp, metallic sound of heavy handcuffs clicking open echoed loudly in the silent room. Bailiff Penhaligon marched over and grabbed Bradley by the exact same shoulder Bradley had violently assaulted the judge with earlier. He twisted the disgraced officer's arms behind his back with practiced, unforgiving force. Click, click. The cold steel locked securely around Bradley's wrists, biting into his skin. The hunter had instantly become the hunted. The arrogant, untouchable cop was now just another broken criminal standing before the bench. Bradley Miller, you are under arrest. The bailiff recited, his booming voice echoing exactly as it had when he announced the judge's arrival. You have the right to remain silent. As Bradley was marched down the center aisle, paraded in chains past the gallery of eagerly snapping cameras, and the jury he had tried to deceive, he caught one final devastating glimpse of Judge Rosalind Hayes. She was already organizing her files for the next case on her docket, entirely unbothered, her posture perfect. His career was completely dead. His freedom was gone, and it was all because he told the wrong woman to get out. The walk from courtroom 302 down to the basement holding area was a journey Bradley Miller had made hundreds of times in his 18-year career. He knew exactly how many steps it took. He knew the precise squeak of the linoleum floors and the flickering hum of the fluorescent lights. But he had never made this walk wearing the silver bracelets himself. Bailiff Arthur Penhaligon did not handle him with kid gloves. The bailiff's grip on Bradley's upper arm was like an iron vice propelling him forcefully into the crowded staff elevator. As the doors slid shut, sealing them inside a small metal box, the silence was deafening. Bradley stared at the floor, his face flushed with a toxic mixture of profound humiliation and absolute disbelief. He felt physically sick. His entire reality had been dismantled, fractured, and burned to the ground in less than 20 minutes. The elevator doors chimed and opened onto the basement level. This was the booking sector, the loud, chaotic nerve center of the courthouse jail. Keep moving, Penhaligon ordered, shoving him slightly forward toward the heavy, reinforced steel door of the processing room. As Bradley was marched into the booking area, the usual chatter of duty officers and processing clerks died instantly. Cops who had known Bradley for a decade, men and women who had shared cheap coffee and complaints about the dispatches with him, stopped dead in their tracks. Their eyes widened as they took in the impossible sight, the arrogant, untouchable veteran stripped of his authority, paraded in as a criminal. Nobody offered a sympathetic nod. Nobody spoke. The silence was the ultimate condemnation. Sergeant William Davies, a grizzled booking officer who had laughed at Bradley's crude jokes just yesterday, stood behind the elevated processing desk. His face was a mask of cold professional detachment. Empty your pockets, Miller. Sergeant Davies commanded, not using Bradley's rank. He didn't say officer. That title had already evaporated. With trembling, awkward fingers restricted by the tight handcuffs, Bradley managed to empty his pockets. His heavy loaded service weapon and his spare magazines had already been confiscated by the bailiff upstairs. Now he was forced to surrender his leather wallet, his keys, and finally, with a sickening twist in his gut, he reached up to his chest. He unpinned the Silver Shield badge number 4482 and placed it onto the scratched metallic counter. It sounded like a hollow death knell as it hit the steel. "Take him to holding cell 4. Davies instructed a junior deputy, not sparing Bradley a second glance. Bradley was escorted down a long, narrow corridor, smelling sharply of industrial bleach and stale sweat. They stopped in front of a heavy steel door with a small reinforced glass window. Cell 4. The deputy slid the heavy deadbolt back with a loud mechanical clank. The door swung open. Bradley was shoved inside, and the door slammed shut behind him. The lock engaged with a terrifying finality. He stood alone in the centre of the tiny concrete box. There was a metal toilet in the corner and a hard steel bench bolted to the grey cinder-block wall. It was freezing cold. There were no windows, no natural light, just the harsh, unblinking glare of a caged bulb overhead. Bradley slowly sank onto the metal bench, burying his face in his hands. A raw, guttural sob tore from his throat. "Get out of here before I throw you in a holding cell." His own arrogant words spoken just hours ago echoed mockingly in the silent confines of his new reality. He had threatened Judge Rosalind Hayes with this exact room. He had thought he was a god in a blue uniform, capable of crushing anyone who bruised his fragile ego. Now he was the one locked in the cage, but the nightmare was only just beginning. An hour later, the heavy door opened again. Captain David Reynolds, Bradley's commanding officer, stepped into the cell. He didn't look angry. He looked utterly disgusted. "Captain!" Bradley rasped, jumping to his feet, a desperate glimmer of hope igniting in his chest. "Captain, you have to help me. That judge, she set me up. The defense attorney ambushed me. Shut your mouth, Miller." Captain Reynolds snapped his voice dangerously low. "You are completely out of your mind if you think the department is going to catch you when you fall. I just spent the last hour on the phone with the mayor and the chief of police. The video of you assaulting a superior court judge is already making the rounds on every major news network. You're a liability, and we are cutting the dead weight." Bradley's jaw dropped. "You can't fire me without a union rep. Watch me," Reynolds growled, tossing a manila envelope onto the steel bench. "Effective immediately, your employment with the city is permanently terminated with cause. The police union has publicly declined to represent you. And to make matters worse, ADA Jonathan Croft is cutting a deal. He's testifying against you to save his own law license. He's telling the grand jury that you intentionally lied on your police reports to secure convictions." Bradley's legs gave out. He sat back down heavily, staring blankly at the wall. "Oh, and one more thing," Reynolds added, turning toward the door. "That bakery owner you roughed up last month, he just hired Richard Blaine, the same defense attorney who dismantled you today, to file a massive federal civil rights lawsuit against you personally. They are going to take your pension, your house, and every dime you have left. You did this to yourself, Bradley. Enjoy the cell." The heavy door slammed shut again. The lock clicked. Bradley Miller was left completely alone in the cold, windowless box, utterly destroyed by the heavy, crushing weight of his own karma. The story of Bradley Miller serves as a stark, unforgettable reminder that arrogant power always comes with an expiration date. He built a career on intimidation, hiding behind a badge, to bully those he deemed beneath him. But the universe has a brilliant, poetic way of balancing the scales. By letting his prejudice and bloated ego drive his actions, he blindly assaulted the very person who held his ultimate fate in her hands. Judge Rosalind Hayes didn't need to scream or fight back in the hallway. She simply waited, let him dig his own grave, and then handed him the shovel. True authority doesn't require shouting. It requires absolute, unshakable composure. If this story of instantaneous, brutal karma, hitting back hard, made your day, do us a huge favor. Hit that like button, share this video with your friends who love a good justice story, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life dramatic tales. Leave a comment below on what you thought of the judge's brilliant revenge.